It's 1935 in Nazi Germany. A young woman opens a letter stamped with the black seal of the SS. It is not a draft notice. It is not a summons to work. It is not a warning. It is an invitation. The letter informs her that she has been racially selected by the German state. Her ancestry has been traced back generations, her skull measured, her eyes, hair and bone structure recorded, her bloodline certified by doctors she has never met. According to the Nazi regime, she possesses something rare: good blood. And now the state expects her to use it. Not for a job, not for service, for children. Children who will be born for the Reich. Children who will belong to Hitler's future. This was the Lebensborn program, one of the most disturbing social experiments of the Third Reich. Created in 1935 by SS leader Heinrich Himmler, Lebensborn was presented to the public as a charitable network of maternity homes that helped struggling mothers. But behind the clean hospital walls and carefully written paperwork was something very different: a state-run breeding program. Women deemed racially valuable were encouraged or pressured to bear children with members of the SS. Babies born inside these homes were registered, studied, and sometimes taken away to be raised by loyal Nazi families. And as the war spread across Europe, the program grew darker still. SS units began kidnapping children from occupied countries, Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, searching for boys and girls who looked Aryan. Those who passed racial examinations were given new German names and placed into German families, their pasts erased. Their parents left searching for children who had simply disappeared. By the end of the war, tens of thousands of children had been born into or absorbed by this system. Many grew up never knowing who they really were. Some only discovered the truth decades later. Others are still searching today. This is not the story of a battlefield or a concentration camp. It is the story of something quieter, more bureaucratic, and in many ways more unsettling. A regime that tried to manufacture a master race, not only through ideology and war, but through birth itself. These were the children bred for Hitler. How did the program begin? How many children were taken? And what happened to them after the Third Reich collapsed? To understand that story, we have to begin with the man who imagined it. A man who believed the future of Europe could be engineered like a breeding program on a farm. Heinrich Himmler. To understand Lebensborn, you must first understand Heinrich Himmler. Not the uniform, not the rank, but the man underneath them. Born in 1900 in Munich, Himmler was the son of a school teacher. As a young man, he was unremarkable. He trained as an agronomist. He kept meticulous personal diaries filled with observations about farming, discipline, and race. Long before he commanded the most feared organization in the Third Reich, he was raising chickens on a small property and studying the selective breeding of livestock. The language of genetics in agriculture would never leave him. It simply found a larger canvas. Himmler rose through the Nazi Party in the late 1920s and early 1930s, attaching himself to Adolf Hitler with a loyalty that was total and unquestioning. By 1929, he was the Reichsführer SS, the head of the SS, which at that time numbered fewer than 300 men. Within a decade, he had transformed it into a force of hundreds of thousands. A state within a state, a police apparatus, an intelligence service, and a racial enforcement body all fused into one. Central to Himmler's worldview was the concept of the Aryan race, a mythologized, pseudo-scientific construct that posited the existence of a biologically superior Northern European people. This was not fringe ideology. It was mainstream Nazi doctrine. But Himmler took it further than almost anyone else. He was not merely interested in protecting the Aryan race from what he called corruption. He was interested in actively breeding it into dominance. The problem, as Himmler saw it, was demographic. Germany had lost nearly 2 million men in the First World War. Birth rates were falling. The wrong people in Himmler's calculus were reproducing too freely. And the right people, tall, fair, healthy, of certified Germanic descent, were not reproducing fast enough. His solution was not subtle. In a 1935 speech, Himmler argued that every SS man had a racial duty to father children, not just within marriage, outside it if necessary. Illegitimacy, he declared, was no shame when the offspring were racially valuable. It was a service to the nation. This was a radical departure from conventional German morality. The church, conservative society, and even many within the Nazi Party found the idea troubling. But Himmler was not interested in conventional morality. He was building a biological future. And so, on December 12, 1935, a date Himmler chose with deliberate symbolism, as it was the winter solstice in the Old Norse calendar, the Lebensborn organization was officially founded. It was registered as a registered association, a quasi-charitable body, partially funded by SS membership dues. Its stated purpose was to support racially valuable mothers and their children. In practice, it was the institutional infrastructure for everything Himmler had been planning. The founding document was explicit. Lebensborn existed to support large families that met racial and hereditary requirements, to provide care for racially valuable mothers, to care for the children produced by such unions, and, critically, to ensure that children born outside of marriage, the product of liaisons between SS men and racially certified women, would have institutional support and a path to legitimacy. From its first day, it was not a welfare organization. It was a breeding program. But who exactly would be selected for it? How would the machinery of racial measurement work in practice? And what happened to the women who entered its network? Women who, in many cases, had no idea what they were truly becoming part of. The answer lay in a system so methodical, so administrative, so thoroughly German in its paperwork and procedure that it almost disguised what it was entirely. The first Lebensborn home opened in August 1936 in Steinhöring, a small town southeast of Munich. From the outside, it was unremarkable. A large country house, set back from the road, surrounded by trees and gardens. It had the look of a private sanatorium or perhaps an upscale boarding house. The nurses wore uniforms. The grounds were well kept. There was a nursery, a dining hall, a medical wing. Inside, the process was clinical. Every woman who sought admission to a Lebensborn home underwent what was called a racial and biological examination. This was not a single test. It was a battery of assessments conducted by SS-affiliated physicians and racial specialists. It measured skull dimensions, eye color, hair texture, skin tone, height and body proportions. It traced family trees going back generations, looking for evidence of Jewish, Roma, Slavic, or otherwise. In Nazi terminology, undesirable ancestry. It reviewed medical histories for hereditary illness, including epilepsy, mental illness, and certain chronic conditions. The examiners were, in the language of the regime, racial scientists, but their science was not science in any legitimate sense. It was measurement in service of ideology. The criteria they applied were pseudo-scientific constructs rooted in 19th century eugenics, stripped of even the modest rigor that movement had claimed. They were looking for a type, and if a woman matched that type, she was accepted. If she did not, she was turned away. The program was initially designed around a specific set of circumstances. An SS man had fathered a child with a woman who was not his wife. The woman faced social stigma, economic hardship, and the practical problem of raising a child alone. Lebensborn offered an alternative. She could apply to enter a home during her pregnancy, receive medical care, give birth in a controlled environment, and receive support for herself and her child afterward. In return, the SS would record the birth. The child would be registered as a child of the Reich. The SS man's identity was often not disclosed, even in the records. His role was genetic. His paternity was a state secret. But the program expanded rapidly beyond this original framework. By the late 1930s, Lebensborn homes were not merely receiving women who were already pregnant. They were facilitating introductions. SS men were encouraged to spend time at the homes. Women with the appropriate racial profile were invited to social events, recreational gatherings, and holiday programs. The intention was not ambiguous. The Reich wanted these people to produce children together. Himmler himself was explicit about this in internal correspondence. He wrote of the duty of racially valuable German women to bear children regardless of their marital status. He described illegitimate children of SS men as gifts to the German nation. He instructed his administrators that any woman who refused to participate in the program on moral grounds was simply failing to understand her obligation to her people. The homes themselves were not austere. They were deliberately made comfortable. Good food, proper medical care, attractive surroundings. Himmler understood that he was asking women to participate in something that most of German society still considered shameful. The comfort was an inducement. The institutional legitimacy was a reassurance. And for some women, young, unmarried, with limited resources, the offer was genuinely difficult to refuse. Some entered willingly. Some entered under social pressure. Some, particularly in later years and occupied territories, entered under circumstances that cannot be distinguished from coercion. The line between participation and compulsion was, by design, never clearly drawn. By 1939, there were 8 Lebensborn homes operating in Germany. Thousands of women had passed through them. Thousands of children had been born within their walls, and the program was about to expand in ways its original architects had not publicly envisioned. The war was coming, and with it, something far darker than anything that had happened yet. Step through the front door of a Lebensborn home, and the first thing that struck a visitor was order. Everything was clean, everything was organized. The staff moved with efficiency, the records were immaculate. Pregnant women arrived at various stages of their pregnancies. They were given physical examinations, assigned rooms, and integrated into the routine of the home. The diet was controlled. Adequate caloric intake, attention to vitamins, no alcohol, no smoking. There were daily walks, medical checkups, light exercise. In some homes, there were lectures on motherhood, on the duties of the racially valuable German woman, on the nobility of bearing children for the Führer. The births were attended by trained SS physicians and midwives. Infant mortality was tracked. Health outcomes were recorded with the same fastidiousness applied to livestock breeding records, because that is, in essence, what they were: livestock records. The children born in these homes were not, in the minds of those who ran the program, simply children. They were biological products of a deliberate process. After birth, women faced a choice, though in practice, the word choice carries complicated weight. They could keep their child and leave the home with some financial support, or they could surrender the child to the SS for placement. Placed children would be adopted by SS families, carefully selected for their own racial credentials and raised as model citizens of the new Germany. Some women made this decision freely, others were pressured. In some cases, women who had expected to keep their children found themselves in a bureaucratic system that made it extraordinarily difficult to do so. The homes kept the legal paperwork. The SS controlled the adoption process. A young woman without resources, without family support, without a husband. She could fight the system, or she could sign the forms. Many signed the forms. The children who were adopted into SS families were given new names. Their original birth records were frequently sealed or altered. They were raised without knowledge of how they had entered the world, who their biological parents were, or what institution had arranged their placement. Some were raised in loving homes. Some were not. All were told a version of their origin that was, at minimum, incomplete. Former Lebensborn children who have spoken in later decades describe a specific and recurring experience: the moment of discovery. The old documents, the sealed files, the records that the German government spent decades resisting opening. One woman, interviewed in the 1990s, described finding her birth certificate in a box of her late adoptive mother's possessions. The certificate bore the heading of the Lebensborn organization. She was nearly 60 years old. She had never known. Others grew up knowing something was wrong, but not what. An adoptive parent who shut down certain conversations, a family story that did not quite hold together, a document that no one could quite explain. The homes themselves were sites of absolute institutional control. Everything that happened within them was recorded, classified, and filed. The SS maintained detailed records of racial assessments, medical outcomes, birth weights, developmental milestones. In some homes, children were photographed at regular intervals, formal, clinical portraits that documented their physical development as evidence of the program's biological success. These were not just children. They were data points in Himmler's grand experiment. But even within the sanitized world of the Lebensborn homes, the violence of the broader system was never far away. Women who were deemed not racially adequate after initial screening were expelled. Women who fell ill with inheritable conditions were removed. One former home employee, testifying after the war, described watching a woman be informed that her application had been rejected due to a discovered great-grandparent of non-Germanic descent. The woman's distress, the employee said, was extreme. She had nowhere else to go. The system did not care. The system had a quota to meet, and as the war expanded Germany's reach across Europe, the program was about to find a new and far more brutal source of raw material. September 1939. Germany invades Poland. By spring 1940, Denmark and Norway have fallen. France follows. By the early 1940s, the Wehrmacht occupies vast stretches of Europe, from the Atlantic coast of France to the steppes of the Soviet Union. For Heinrich Himmler, this was not merely military conquest, it was an opportunity. In the occupied territories, the Lebensborn program transformed. What had been, within Germany, a program of voluntary or semi-voluntary participation, became, in the East especially, something qualitatively different. SS racial specialists moved through occupied Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and the Balkans, conducting sweeps through villages and towns. They were looking for children. Not all children, specific children. The racial specialists had their criteria: height, coloring, skeletal structure, eye and hair color. A blonde-haired, blue-eyed child in a Polish village drew their attention. Such a child, in Himmler's framework, might carry Germanic blood that had been diluted over generations of intermarriage. That blood, he argued, could be recovered, repatriated in a biological sense, brought back into the Reich. The program for doing this was called Germanization. And it began with abduction. SS units and police auxiliaries moved through occupied territories with lists and criteria. In some cases, parents were told their children were being taken for education, for healthcare, for temporary placement. In others, no explanation was offered at all. Children were simply taken, loaded onto vehicles, transported west. The numbers are difficult to establish precisely because the records were deliberately destroyed or hidden as the war turned. But estimates from post-war investigations suggest that between 50,000 and 100,000 children were abducted from occupied Poland alone. Some historians estimate several 100,000 across Europe. Many historians regard 100,000 as a cautious conservative figure. These children were transported to special Lebensborn homes and racial processing centers. There, they underwent the same battery of examinations as the German women who had entered the program voluntarily. Those who passed were given new German names. Their Polish, Czech, Ukrainian, or Yugoslav names were erased. They were assigned to German families, often without any record that could later be traced. They were told that their parents had died, or had abandoned them, or simply that Germany was their home now. Some were given to Lebensborn homes directly. Others were placed with SS families or ordinary German families who had applied for children through official channels and asked no difficult questions. One documented case from Poland illustrates the scale of the individual tragedy within the statistical whole. A family from the Zamość region, a region subjected to one of the most intensive SS depopulation campaigns of the war, had their 3 children removed during a village sweep in 1943. The parents survived the war. For years, they searched. They contacted relief agencies, submitted names to international tracing organizations, placed announcements in newspapers. They recovered one child, years later, from a German orphanage. The child no longer spoke Polish. He did not recognize his parents. He had been told his name was Klaus. He was 4 years old when he was taken. He was 9 when his mother found him. He is not an exceptional case. He is one among hundreds of thousands. The Lebensborn homes that received these children operated with a deliberate amnesia. Documentation was falsified. Origins were concealed. In some cases, birth records were forged to show German parentage, complete with fabricated names and dates. The children entered the German population with identities that had been constructed from nothing. Their actual histories were classified, stored in Lebensborn archives that the SS intended to destroy before the Allies arrived. They did not fully succeed in that destruction, but the records that survived were fragmentary, incomplete, and deliberately confusing. Tracing a single child through the system, even with access to the surviving archives, often required years of work. Meanwhile, in Norway, the program took yet another form, and the legacy it left there would become one of the most publicly examined chapters of the entire Lebensborn story. Norway fell to German forces in April 1940. Within months, the SS apparatus had established itself across the occupied country, and within that apparatus, the Lebensborn program found extraordinarily fertile ground. Himmler had a particular regard for Norway. In his racial schema, the Norse people occupied an elevated position. Tall, fair, physically vigorous. They represented, in his telling, some of the purest surviving stock of the ancient Germanic peoples. Norway was not to Himmler a conquered enemy nation. It was a lost cousin. And he intended to strengthen the ties between the two peoples in the most literal biological sense possible. SS soldiers and other German military personnel stationed in Norway were encouraged to form relationships with Norwegian women. The ideological framing was explicit. Any child born of such a union was a gift to both nations, a strengthening of the Nordic bloodline. Lebensborn homes were established across Norway. Eventually 9 of them, the largest network outside Germany itself. They offered the same services as their German counterparts: prenatal care, childbirth, postnatal support. Norwegian women who became pregnant by German soldiers were, in many cases, in extraordinarily difficult positions. In a deeply occupied nation, the power dynamics between an occupying military force and the civilian population were never simple. Some relationships were genuinely voluntary. Others were conducted under conditions of economic dependence, social pressure, or direct coercion that make the concept of consent deeply complicated. Approximately 10,000 to 12,000 children were born to Norwegian mothers and German fathers during the occupation. Of these, roughly 8,000 passed through the Lebensborn system in some form. The liberation of Norway in May 1945 did not bring these children freedom. It brought them a different kind of persecution. Norwegian society, emerging from 5 years of occupation, was engaged in a process of purging those seen as collaborators. Women who had been involved with German soldiers were subjected to public humiliation. Their heads were shaved in town squares. They were paraded through the streets. Some were prosecuted. Some were institutionalized. Their children bore the brunt of a society's rage and shame. They were called Tiskerbarn, German children. In schools, they were bullied, beaten, and excluded. In some instances, they were taken from their mothers and placed in institutions for the mentally deficient. Not because they had any disability, but because the Norwegian authorities classified them as potentially genetically inferior due to their German paternity. This is not a footnote. Norwegian government investigations conducted in the 1990s and 2000s established that state authorities had systematically discriminated against these children for decades after the war. Some were sent to mental institutions not once, but repeatedly. Some were subjected to pharmaceutical trials without consent. The Norwegian state formally apologized in 2005. A compensation fund was established. But for many of the remaining survivors, the apology came too late. One woman, now in her 80s, testified to a Norwegian parliamentary inquiry that she had spent 30 years in an institution. She was not mentally ill. She had been classified as deficient at the age of 7 because her father had been a German soldier, and she had spent the decades that followed fighting a bureaucracy that had decided, before she could speak for herself, what her life was worth. Her case was not unique. In Germany, meanwhile, the Lebensborn children who had remained in the country faced a different kind of silence. As the Reich collapsed, SS families burned documents. Adoptive parents told children nothing. The official records that had defined these children's very existence were scattered, hidden, or deliberately destroyed. Thousands of people born into the Lebensborn system grew up in post-war Germany, not knowing what they were, not knowing that their births had been engineered, not knowing that their identities had been constructed by an SS administrative apparatus, not knowing that somewhere in a sealed archive, a file existed that contained the truth of who they actually were. Some suspected, some discovered fragments, and some, as they aged and as German society slowly began to open the archives, found the full truth and were shattered by it. The question of what happened when the Reich finally fell, and who was held responsible for all of it, would define the post-war decades. By early 1945, the architecture of the Reich was failing. Soviet forces advanced from the east. American and British forces pushed from the west. The SS, which had built and administered the Lebensborn program, was in retreat. The order went out to destroy the records. SS administrators at Lebensborn homes across Germany and occupied Europe received instructions to burn files, shred documents, and evacuate. In some locations, this was carried out with the thoroughness one might expect from an organization that had spent a decade perfecting bureaucratic precision. Entire filing systems disappeared. In others, the collapse came too quickly. Staff fled. Documents were left behind in filing cabinets, basements, and storage rooms, where they were eventually recovered by Allied forces and German investigators. What survived was fragmentary, but it was enough. The Lebensborn organization was investigated as part of the broader Nuremberg trials process. Case 8, tried before the American Military Tribunal in 1947 and 1948, was known as the RuSHA trial, named after the Race and Resettlement Main Office of the SS, which had overseen much of the racial screening and abduction work. 8 defendants were tried for their roles in the Germanization program, which included the abduction of children and the forced racial processing of civilians. The defendants employed a range of arguments in their defense. Several argued that the Lebensborn homes were simply maternity facilities, charitable institutions providing medical care to mothers in need. They denied knowledge of the abduction program. They claimed that the children placed in German homes had been orphans or had been voluntarily surrendered by their parents. They presented themselves as welfare administrators, not racial engineers. The tribunal was not persuaded. Ulrich Greifeld, the chief administrator of the organization responsible for Germanization policy, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Others received sentences ranging from 25 years to time served. Greifeld died in prison in 1949. Several others were released early in the amnesty provisions of the 1950s as West Germany and the Western Allies shifted focus to the emerging Cold War and the practical need to rebuild German society with the personnel available. The specific charge of child abduction was, in legal terms, unprecedented. The tribunal had to construct a framework for prosecuting the systematic removal of children as a crime against humanity. The arguments made in Case 8 contributed to the development of international law around cultural genocide and the forced transfer of children, elements that would later appear in the 1948 Genocide Convention. But the legal proceedings, however significant, could not undo what had been done. They could not return a child to parents who had died searching. They could not restore a stolen identity. They could not unwrite the years spent in a Norwegian institution by a girl classified as deficient because her father had worn the wrong uniform. Heinrich Himmler himself never faced trial. He was captured by British forces in May 1945 while attempting to flee in disguise. When his captors discovered his identity, he bit down on a cyanide capsule and died within minutes. The man who had conceived the program, who had written its founding documents, who had signed the orders that set it all in motion, he escaped the accounting that the courts demanded of his subordinates. His records, however, survived in part, and they told a story that no defense argument could obscure. The Lebensborn program had, by its own internal documentation, registered approximately 8,000 births in Germany alone between 1936 and 1945. In Norway, another 8,000 to 12,000. In other occupied territories, the numbers are less precise but substantial. The abduction program had removed hundreds of thousands of children from their families across Eastern Europe. Of those children, the precise fate of the majority remains unknown to this day. International tracing organizations worked for decades after the war to reunite families. The International Tracing Service, based in Arolsen, Germany, accumulated millions of documents, the largest archive related to Nazi persecution in the world. The Lebensborn records that survived were eventually integrated into this archive. They became a resource for searches. But a record in an archive is only useful if you know to look for it, and tens of thousands of Lebensborn children grew up without knowing there was anything to look for. For decades after the war, the German government resisted full disclosure. This was not a simple matter of bureaucratic delay. There were active institutional interests in keeping the Lebensborn records sealed. Adoptive families, many of them respectable post-war German citizens, did not want their carefully maintained family histories disrupted. Former SS members, some of whom had fathered children through the program, did not want biological connections established. And the children themselves, now adults, often struggled with the implications of what they might find. The first significant legal opening came in the 1960s when a handful of individuals managed to obtain partial records. But it was not until the late 1980s and 1990s, as the Cold War ended and Germany entered a sustained period of historical reckoning with the Nazi past, that the archives began to open in meaningful ways. Organizations established specifically to support Lebensborn survivors emerged in Germany and Norway. They helped individuals navigate the bureaucracy of records requests, provided support during the process of discovery, and, eventually, connected people who were searching for one another. Some of these connections led to reunions between children and their biological families, sometimes across national borders, sometimes across languages, sometimes across the gulf of 70 or more years. One reunion documented in the German press involved a Polish woman in her 60s and a German man who had been raised as an only child. The woman had been told that her infant son had died shortly after his abduction during the Zamisch deportations of 1943. She had mourned him for 60 years. The man had been told that he was German, that his parents had died in the war, and that he had been fortunate to be placed with a good family. Through the Arelsen archives and a German tracing organization, they were connected. DNA testing confirmed their relationship. The reunion was conducted through an interpreter. The woman was 84 years old. The man was 65. She died 2 years after they found each other. In Norway, the process of reckoning took on a distinct public dimension. The survivors of the Norwegian Lebensborn homes, the so-called war children, organized politically, lobbied their government, and eventually forced an official inquiry. The inquiry, completed in 2002, was damning. It confirmed that the Norwegian state had not merely failed to protect these children after the war. In many documented cases, it had actively participated in their persecution. The compensation process that followed was contested and slow. Many survivors felt that the amount offered, equivalent to a few thousand euros, was inadequate not just financially, but symbolically. It did not acknowledge the decades of institutionalization, the forced sterilizations that some survivors reported, or the systematic nature of what had been done. Some survivors refused the compensation entirely. One man, speaking to a Norwegian broadcaster in 2010, said simply, "They want to pay me to stop talking. I will not stop talking." He was 70 years old. He had spent 32 of those years in institutions. He had been told his entire life that he was mentally deficient. He had never been mentally deficient. He had been inconvenient. In Germany, the descendants of Lebensborn participants, not just the children themselves, but their own children and grandchildren, have increasingly engaged with this history. A small but significant number of Germans born in the 1950s and 1960s have discovered, through DNA databases and genealogical research, that their parents or grandparents were connected to the Lebensborn program. The revelation carries complex emotional weight. There is no single way to process the knowledge that one's family history is bound up with a system designed to breed human beings for an ideology. Some have written about it. Some have sought therapy. Some have traveled to Norway or Poland to meet the other side of a family equation that was created by force. The archives, imperfect as they are, continue to yield answers. New methodologies, particularly genetic genealogy, the same tools used to solve cold case murders, have enabled connections that paper records alone could not establish. A child abducted in 1943, placed in a German family, raised with a false name, is now a person in their 80s who might share DNA with cousins in Warsaw or Krakow who have been searching for any trace of a family member who disappeared. The searching continues. It does not end. And as the survivors age, the urgency grows. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs specifically to those who discover, late in life, that the story they were told about themselves is false. It is not the grief of loss, exactly, though there is loss in it. It is the grief of displacement, of standing in a life that suddenly has a different address. The Lebensborn survivors who have spoken publicly in the decades since the war are not a monolithic group. They come from different countries, different circumstances, different experiences. Some were born in Germany to German mothers who entered the program with some degree of awareness of what it was. Others were born in Norway to women who were in complicated and often coercive relationships with German soldiers. Others were abducted as young children from occupied Poland, Ukraine, or Yugoslavia, and have almost no reliable information about their biological origins. What many of them share is the experience of institutional silence, the sense that an official world knew something about them that it refused to disclose. Guntram Weber, not his original name if he ever had one, was born in a Lebensborn home in Bavaria in 1943. he was adopted as an infant by a German family. He grew up knowing nothing of his origins. As an adult, he became interested in genealogy and discovered, through a combination of archival research and DNA testing, that his biological mother had been a Norwegian woman who had passed through the program. His biological father was an SS officer whose records survived in part. He spent years attempting to learn more. He wrote to archives. He submitted requests to the German government. He worked through organizations dedicated to Lebensborn research. He eventually traveled to Norway and found a community of people whose stories were versions of his own. He wrote about the experience in terms that resonate widely among survivors, the sense that the most fundamental facts of his existence had been classified, as if he were a state secret rather than a person. This is the language that recurs: state secret, data point, product of the program. Hildegard Trutz, a German woman who was placed in a Lebensborn home in the late 1930s and consented to repeated liaisons with SS men at the program's encouragement, gave one of the earliest post-war testimonies about the experience. She described the ideological pressure within the homes, the constant framing of reproduction as duty, of the body as an instrument of the Reich. She described being told, after bearing 3 children who were all placed for adoption, that she had served Germany well. She described not knowing, for many years afterward, where those children were. She eventually located one of them. The reunion was, by her account, incomplete. The child, by then a young adult, had been raised with a false history and did not know how to integrate the truth into the life they had built. Some truth arrived too late to be fully absorbed. Anna Zmijewska, a Polish woman interviewed by the Red Cross Tracing Service in 1948, described watching her daughter be taken from her doorstep by 2 men in uniform. The child was 2 years old. She was told the child was being taken for medical examination. She never saw her again. She spent the remaining 30 years of her life searching. She died without finding her. Whether that child survived, was placed in a German family, and grew up speaking German in a city whose name her mother never knew. That question does not have a documented answer. There are thousands of questions like it. Some will never have answers. The psychological literature on Lebensborn survivors is relatively thin, partly because identifying the population has been difficult, and partly because many survivors have been reluctant to engage with academic research. But the studies that exist describe consistent patterns: identity disruption, difficulty forming stable attachments, a particular sensitivity to questions of belonging and origin, recurring dreams about searching. One psychologist who worked extensively with Norwegian war children described a phenomenon she called genealogical bewilderment, a term coined earlier in the adoption literature, but particularly applicable here. When the foundations of a person's identity, their name, their parents, their nation, their history, have been fabricated by an institution for ideological purposes, the reconstruction of self that must follow is among the most demanding psychological tasks a human being can undertake. Some undertook it. Some could not. Some undertook it and found something on the other side that they could live with. And some, well into their old age, are still searching. In 1936, Heinrich Himmler wrote a memorandum to his staff. It contained a projection. By 1980, he estimated, the SS selective breeding program would have produced a sufficient quantity of racially superior Germans to permanently transform the demographic and cultural character of Europe. The program would, in his words, run itself. The machinery was sound. The population would follow. He was wrong about the projection. He was wrong about the machinery. And he was wrong about the population. But the machinery operated for 9 years, and the consequences of those 9 years are still being measured. The Lebensborn program represents something that does not fit neatly into the categories we typically use when discussing Nazi atrocity. It was not a death camp. It did not produce corpses in the immediate, industrial sense that places like Auschwitz or Treblinka did. Its victims, the women who were processed through its homes, the children who were born or abducted into its system, often survived. Many lived long lives. Many had families of their own. But what was done to them was a violation of the most fundamental human categories we possess. The violation of the bond between parent and child, the violation of personal identity, the violation of the right to know one's own history, the reduction of human beings to their biological function, the transformation of reproduction, the most intimate of human processes, into a state-administered industrial program. These violations do not diminish with time. They accumulate. The children of the Lebensborn program, those born within its homes and those abducted into its system, are, as of this writing, in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. Some have spent their entire adult lives not knowing the truth of their origins. Some discovered the truth and spent their remaining years attempting to rebuild an identity from fragments. Some died still searching. Their children and grandchildren carry the consequences. A history that was hidden does not disappear. It shifts. It changes form. It surfaces in DNA tests taken for curiosity, in family photographs that do not quite make sense, in medical histories that do not match the stories told at the dinner table. The German government has made significant progress in opening the archives. The Norwegian government has apologized. International genealogical resources have made searches possible that were unimaginable 20 years ago. The researchers, archivists, and survivor advocates who have spent their careers on this history have done essential work. But several things must be said plainly. The full accounting is not complete. Estimates of the number of children abducted into the Germanization program range from 50,000 to 400,000. The upper end of that range is not a fringe estimate. It is accepted by serious historians. The fate of the majority of those children has never been established. Some were killed when they failed racial screening. Some died in German homes during Allied bombing. Some survived the war, were placed in orphanages, and disappeared into the post-war chaos. Some are still alive, still unknown to themselves and to the families who lost them. There are people living today whose names were changed before they could remember their names, who were told false stories about their origins before they could question stories, who were inserted into a genealogical line that was constructed to serve an ideology they knew nothing about and could not have consented to resist. They deserve to know. Not as a political gesture, not as a form of closure. There is no closure available for what was done to them, but as an acknowledgement of the most basic human claim, the right to know who you are and where you come from. In the late 1980s, a German documentary filmmaker working on a project about the Lebensborn program tracked down a woman who had been born in the Steinhöring home, the very first Lebensborn facility, opened in 1936. She was in her early 50s. She had known, for most of her adult life, that she was a Lebensborn child. She had made a kind of peace with it, she said. She had built a life. The filmmaker asked her what she wanted people to know about the program. She thought for a moment. Then she said, they wanted to breed a master race. They bred people who spent their whole lives trying to find out who they were. That is what they made. It is an indictment that no trial fully captured. It is a consequence that no sentence adequately addresses. The Lebensborn program was not a footnote to the Nazi project. It was one of its central expressions, the attempt to apply the full power of a modern industrial state to the reshaping of human biological destiny. It failed, but it left behind a human cost that extends across 3 generations and continues to unfold. Remembering it clearly is not an academic exercise. It is a moral one. The children who were bred for Hitler did not choose their origins, but they are ours to account for. And the silence that surrounded them for so long is itself a form of complicity that we must refuse to repeat. Their names were changed, their histories were stolen, Their identities were fabricated by a state that treated them as instruments. But they were not instruments. They were people. They are people. And they are still waiting to be seen. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.